Hello. Welcome back to our series of walking through the Gospel of Mark. Now, to give you a quick recap of what we've gone through over Mark chapter 2 and 3, is we have gone over the controversy stories. If you remember, there are four of them. Jesus forgave sins, Jesus calls tax collectors, and he challenges those social statuses. Fasting and how the old covenant does not fit in the new, and how Jesus works on the Sabbath. Now, these controversy stories then kind of hit their climax, if you remember, in he calls the disciples and that unforgivable sin, which then Jesus hits this point. Mark hits this point where Mark is trying to get his readers to decide which side they are on in these controversies. Do they believe the Pharisees when they call him working through the power of Beelzebub, or do they believe in Jesus and his ministry? And so these are kind of what we have going through Mark 2 and 3. Now, we end up hitting Mark 4. Now, Mark 4 is actually a lot of parables. And so we actually are not going, I don't cover Mark 4 parables in particular, because I usually have an entire section just on parables, because they're kind of their own kind of thing that really takes a little bit to figure out how to interpret, as they follow different kind of rules. So we cover them all at once to make life really easy. What we are going to look at is we're looking at areas that Jesus is Lord over. Yes, Jesus is God and he's Lord over everything. That is true. But I think to an extent, Mark wants us to know what kind of things Jesus is Lord over. You got to remember their culture where they had different gods who were over different things. And so I think Mark is making some statements here in the next few stories about what Jesus is Lord over. And so that's what we're going to be hitting. And we're going to really focus in on Mark 4, 35 to 41, because this is the only non-parable in Mark chapter 4. And so we're going to look at what is Jesus Lord over according to this story. And so here we go. We're going to read Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. It says, "As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let's cross over to the other side of the lake.' So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus is sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, 'Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?' When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, 'Silence, be still.' And suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?' The disciples were absolutely terrified. 'Who is this man?' They asked each other. 'Even the wind and the waves obey him.'" And so here we get this story of Jesus kind of crossing to the other side. And so Mark 34. Now, I always say, for students and reading the Gospels in particular, anything narrative, you should look for what's known as your 5 W's. Your who, what, where, when, why. And so we should already be, as we were going through that, we could easily look for kind of our who in the story, right? We have the disciples, we have Jesus, we even have other boats that are following him. When is this happening, or where is this happening? This is happening on the Sea of Galilee in particular, right? And so you can start to put these pieces together, known as the 5 W's. I always encourage doing that before you even really go through it. Now, some of the questions that have to start getting asked, because sometimes people are like, oh, this is not written from an eyewitness, etc., etc. But like, if we really look closely, we can actually tell how this is most likely written by an eyewitness, or like the story was told to someone who was an actual eyewitness. Okay? And there's lots of details in it that show that. And so one thing to know about the Sea of Galilee is that the way the mountains are arranged kind of on either side is if the wind blew certain directions, it would actually funnel down the valley and create massive waves. And so if you remember the calling of the disciples, several disciples are fishermen. And so this is their profession. So when they wake up, like they've been on this, not when they wake up, but they have been on the Sea of Galilee a lot over the years because many of them are fishermen. So when they wake Jesus up, they say, Teacher, do you not care if we drown? I don't think they're being dramatic. They genuinely believe that they are going to drown. The boat is filling with water. These are professional fishermen, many of them. And so they know what they're talking about. This isn't like someone who's never been on a boat before and they go to the beach or they go on a boat and they get 2-3 foot waves and they start panicking because they've never been on a boat. These are people who have been on a boat. They know what they are talking about, okay? So how we know it's an eyewitness? Notice a lot of the details, okay? Did you notice it? Jesus, it tells us exactly where he's sleeping. Tells us what he's sleeping on. Tells us what they said when they woke up. Like, it is pretty particular, and so it's going to be from an eyewitness. Now, even once the storm calms down, Jesus goes, "Where is your faith?" And it says that the disciples are super scared. They're terrified. And the question becomes, why would they be terrified? The waves have stopped. There's no more waves, there's no more wind, it's all stopped. Why are they scared? For that, we need to think through a few passages in the Bible. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but in Job 12:15, it ends up saying this, and it's saying it about God. It says, if he holds back the rain, the earth becomes a desert. If he releases the waters, they flood the earth. Or Job 28:25. God decided how hard the winds should blow and how much rain should fall. Or Psalms 33:7. God assigned the sea its boundaries and locked the oceans in vast reservoirs. Or Psalms 107:25-30. It says, God spoke and the wind rose, stirring up waves. Their ships were tossed in the heavens, plunged to the depths. The sailors cringed in terror. They reeled and staggered like drunkards, and were at their wits' end. Lord, help, they cried in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He calmed the storm to a whisper and stilled the waves. What a blessing was that stillness as he brought them safely to the harbor. You see, throughout Scripture, and it's really talked about in the Old Testament, only God can calm waves. Only God can calm storms. Only God can speak to it, and it listens. We see that in the several passages. And so why are they scared? Because no one person should truly be able to do what Jesus just did. The amount of authority he has, the amount of control he has, is quite extensive. Now, why would this be told to Christians in Rome? How would they interpret it? Well, think about what Romans were often going through. Roman Christians in particular, they go through different forms of persecution. They hear that other gods are in control. They're in a very God-filled area. And so this is a good story to remind them of who's actually in control, who truly controls things, as it's not even the emperor. It's not even the Roman emperor. It's not the other gods and deities that the Greeks would worship, that the Romans would worship. It's not them. It's just Jesus. And so you have this kind of encouragement to trust God even in the storm. It might seem like God's not with them, but he actually is throughout it. And part of the reasons why we get this story is that it shows that Jesus is Lord over nature. And so that's the first thing that he's really showing us that Jesus is Lord over. He's Lord over nature. Now, that question of why the disciples are still scared, I think also has another element to it. See, this story actually closely, with some deviations, it does actually closely reflect a different story of someone who gets on a boat and waves happen and everything starts crashing and they all think they're going to die on this boat, but the waves actually stop a different way. Do you know what it is? Think Old Testament. There's a story. It's the story of Jonah. If you know the story of Jonah, Jonah's a prophet and he tries to run from God and he tries to go to the furthest place in the known world from where God had called him because he didn't want to go preach to the Ninevites. And some of the language with Jesus sleeping on the boat and the storm is actually very similar to Jonah 1. You can read it for yourself if you would like and see all the comparisons. But some of them that I could tell you is it says that the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea. There's wind, there's waves. It says that the violent storm threatened to break the ship apart. We're getting the same imagery. In fear of losing their lives, they find Jonah sound asleep down in the hold. They find him there asleep. Same way they find Jesus. But Jonah can't stop the wind and the waves. Instead, he gets thrown into the sea, and God stops the waves. See, vastly different in this story, where they wake him up, and they go, "Do you not care we're going to die? How can you be asleep at a time like this?" They're panicking, and Jesus does something that even Jonah, a prophet, couldn't do. He stops the wind and the waves. And so you have this Old Testament kind of foreshadowing of Jesus in the future. So how do we apply this to our lives? How do we apply this simple story, seeing Jesus is Lord over nature? There's a few things that I would suggest, okay? Firstly, is there some area of your life, where you're looking for a solution in your own strength, and you need to trust God through it? See, Jesus asks if they have faith. He can say, not really asks if they have faith. He says, you have kind of lack of faith. Okay, he accuses them of having lack of faith. Where is your faith? See, faith requires some form of action. So if you're trying to do something in your own strength, find a solution in your own strength, and God might be saying, just trust me through this, maybe we need to show some faith. So if there's an area you're looking for a solution in your own strength, how can you trust God through it? Secondly, life is filled with storms. How can you ensure you trust God through the storm? How can you ensure that? There are things you can do before you sail into a storm that prepare you for when you're in it. And so if you're in a storm now, how can you trust God through it? If you're not in a storm in your life, if your life is going pretty well right now, what can you do? What habit can you create? Who can you surround yourself with? What can you do to prepare yourself before you even hit the storm? Because everyone hits a storm in life. Everyone hits a storm. But whether you get stuck and capsize, or you end up sailing through the rough waters, often comes down to, did you set a foundation? Did you plan ahead? Did you set habits that push you through? I can give that example in my own life when I have faced tragedy and such. There's some old sayings we used to say at church, some catechisms, some different sayings that I would return back to in a storm. One of them is a Psalms. It says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and create a willing spirit to sustain it." That's actually something I have memorized, that when I go through a tough time in life, I actually can say that over and over, and it prepares me, it pushes me through the storm that I'm in. Lastly, we don't want to just focus on us and our storms, but do you know anyone who's going through a tough time right now? And can you encourage them in some way to have faith in Jesus? Or how can you be there for them during this difficult time? Okay? So think of someone you know. We know people who are going through rough things. Think of how you can encourage them. Plan to encourage them. And plan to try to make Jesus there and evident in that difficult situation. Now we've seen the first area Jesus is Lord over in the Gospel of Mark, where he calms the storm and he brings comfort to his readers in Mark, as they can trust him through whatever situations they deal with in Rome.